Welcome to this Gratton Institute webinar. My name is Amy Haywood. I am the Deputy Program Director of Grattan's education team. I come to you today from Wurundjeri lands, and before we start, I want to just acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations people on whose traditional lands we are meeting today, and that we work and also play, and those cultures that are among the oldest in human history. I also want to welcome and I'm excited to welcome my special guest, Ron Berger, who is the Senior Advisor for Teaching and Learning at EL Education. Ron is many things. He is a veteran public school teacher, a master carpenter, I found out, an author, a teacher at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, but also he's had a lot to do with developing curriculum materials. And today that's what we're going to talk to him about, that work that he's been doing at EL Education and as part of a team that work and have developed over decades, the acclaimed K-8 English curriculum materials. They're a set of open source materials. If you're listening, you can probably Google them at the same time, that have been downloaded over 10 million times and are the core curriculum used by many large US cities and districts. So I'm really excited to pick Ron's brain about exactly how he came about creating those and then supporting schools to use them in the US. So many thanks and welcome to you, Ron.
Amy, thank you. I am delighted to be here, and a shout out to all of you Australian educators. Some of the most gratifying work I've done in education has been in my visits to Australia, and it's also one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. So envious of all of you in Australia, and I'm delighted to be able to join you this morning, excuse me.
Yes, and we are a bit jealous, I must say, of your background, which I know is your front yard, and it's much more exciting than the wall I have. But before we start and I get to ask you a number of questions that I have burning, I want to just set the scene a little bit. So we at Grattan are keenly interested in curriculum materials, so interested that we actually wrote an entire report on it. We thought it was going to be a small one, ended up taking us about 12 months. And we were that report is called Ending the Lesson Lottery, How to Improve Curriculum Planning in Schools. It's available freely on our website. We were really interested in understanding what are the benefits of high quality curriculum planning and materials, shed light on the exemplary practice we know is already happening in many schools around Australia, but also recommend practical actions that governments can take. So in doing that, we looked at the literature, we did a new survey of over 2,000 teachers and school leaders, consultations, costings, and then we got to go into 5 case study schools and really highlight their work in that they're already doing in their schools. There's a lot in the report. We're not going to talk about all of it, but just 2 things that I want to highlight are, firstly, a few things that we found from the survey that we did. So teachers really told us that they're struggling with this curriculum planning load. Only 15% of teachers said they have access to a shared bank of high quality curriculum materials for all their classes. About half are saying they're planning mostly on their own, and over half are saying they're not satisfied with the curriculum planning approach in their school. So they're telling us this is tricky. But they also told us when we checked with them, what things could help, they did say shared high quality materials would be a benefit. So 9 out of 10 said, it would improve their classroom practice and that it would also help them to give them more time for that responsive teaching to make sure that they're meeting the needs of the students in their class. So we thought this was something great that could be done by governments. We recognise, though, in the report, and this is, if you look in the report in the chapter 4, where we kind of set out a high level of the recommendations. Ultimately, our report is recommending that schools are able to take a whole school approach, where they've really deliberately sequenced learning across the year levels and then also made links between subjects, and that they're able to, because they've come to that collective agreement, they're then able to share and use the same materials and get that consistency across classes. That means that there's a fair bit of work for schools and a lot of heavy lifting for schools and curriculum leaders to do, and also work for teachers to do in collaborating and planning out and coming to that collective agreement. But we did think there's some things that actually governments and system leaders can help with. So today's conversation is really thinking about what's that bit that governments can do to help and how can that flow through into classrooms and the work that teachers and educators are doing. So today we'll be talking about, and with Ron, about the materials the EL Education have made and made available freely, and also some of that work in professional learning. That's the necessary work to help teachers work together and adapt and collaborate in using those materials. So that's probably the scene set in terms of our report. I will just note that it's not just Grattan that is interested in this issue of curriculum materials. There's also a fair bit of interest in Australia from policymakers too. So the National Teacher Workforce Action Plan was signed off in mid-December by all education ministers. Action 19 has gotten the national curriculum body to look into better supports for curriculum implementation for teachers. So that's something that's happening right now and in train. They'll be reporting back in the next 6 months or so. At the same time, the Productivity Commission has just released a review of the National School Reform Agreement, and they highly recommended more access to high quality, comprehensive materials for teachers. So that's where Grattan sits. That's a bit about the Australian context down under for you, Ron. But I think a great place to start, and I think where we wanted to really start this conversation was the conversation we had with you when we first met you and thought, wow, what an amazing story EL education is. And just to hear a bit from you about EL education, where it started. I know it wasn't originally in curriculum materials, and how you've moved to focusing on and creating curriculum materials over time.
Great, thank you, Amy. So we're an organization, we're a nonprofit based in the US. We don't actually do international work, although we were just on the verge of working with a great educator named Paul Taylor, who lives on the Gold Coast of Australia, when the pandemic hit. And so I hope we can rekindle some formal work in Australia. But we are a national nonprofit in the US, and we started 30 years ago at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Harvard Graduate School of Education in a partnership with Outward Bound. And your listeners may know that Outward Bound is a wilderness organization. But it's not an organization to build wilderness skills. It's an organization to build character and teamwork in the wilderness. And so it was a strange marriage of two organizations. Our focus on academic excellence came from Harvard University, but our focus on character and teamwork and doing more than you think possible, getting everyone to the top of the mountain, every kid to succeed, every child into college or university if they choose, that came from our Outward Bound roots of sort of, we're in this together. And we started in the early 1990s at Harvard with a partnership with 10 schools. We focused particularly on schools in low-income communities. And our model was to transform existing public schools to make them great places. And our model was very different in terms of curriculum than what we'll be talking about today. Our model back then was fully project-based, and we encouraged teachers and supported teachers to create their own curriculum from scratch, to connect it with a local community. That had been my personal experience. I had been in the classroom for 25 years, handcrafting my own curriculum to improve my local community in the rural area where I live. That is my front yard there. I actually do live very rurally. On a dirt road in a tiny town, and my students helped change and improve their town through the curriculum that we hand built. So we were sort of a handcrafted, build your own curriculum organization when we started. We expanded over the next 10 years from 10 schools to 150 schools. We had great success in kids getting good test scores and becoming great people. So we had a lot of interest in the United States in our work. And we wanted to expand it. But every hand-built curriculum, every handcrafted school transformation was crazy hard to do. It's really hard to take a low-performing school and make it a great school. It's really hard to build a school from scratch, especially in a low-income community. And we did it 150 times, but we couldn't do it 1,000 times. We couldn't do it 2,000, 5,000. And philanthropists were coming to us, foundations, and saying, we'd love to fund you if you could just make 3,000 of your schools. And we realized we can't reach that many people. And not every teacher is ready to build her own curriculum. Not every teacher feels like she has the time and expertise to build everything from scratch. And so about 15 years ago, we pivoted and decided, what if we created curriculum that was flexible? So it was comprehensive, but teachers could modify it if they needed to. That would be a starting place for so many teachers that couldn't access our hand-built model. And we began with the idea of creating an English language art curriculum English language arts curriculum that baked in our views about character and teamwork. And it also baked in social justice, because those were part of our mission. So we wanted to have equity and social justice and positive character entwined with kids learning to read and write well. And we applied to a large state in the United States, New York State, to create a curriculum based on the new standards that the state had just adopted. Now, I just have to be honest and say, the leadership of my organization decided to make that move, and I was against it. Mm. I initially felt like, no, you have to handcraft curriculum. You can't use a store-bought curriculum. And I guess, to use a silly metaphor, I was like, we were a small vineyard that produced these very fancy wines, or we were a small brewery that produced great IPAs. And I didn't want to become a big distillery. I didn't want to become a big market thing. I didn't want our beer or our wine sold all over the country. Like I wanted this high quality handcraftedness. And luckily my colleagues outvoted me. And they just said, we're not reaching enough kids this way. We have 150 schools, but they're like little handcrafted breweries or vineyards that only special people can get to. Like, we need this everywhere. And fortunately, I was outvoted. And I was part of creating the first version of our curriculum that we submitted to New York State. And remarkably, we were accepted. So we were a small organization. Some of the other people that had submitted proposals were big, like Pearson, who had 40,000 employees. And we had very few employees. But we had a vision that they liked. And so we started by building an English curriculum for New York State. And it was so successful in New York State that other states wanted it. And it was online, so they started downloading it. And then we went to foundations and said, we'll create a national version of it if you can help fund the creation of it. And so what started as a 3 to 5 curriculum became a 3 to 8 curriculum, and then a K to 8 curriculum, and then started spreading across the country. And now the majority of our work is actually supporting schools and districts all over the United States to implement this curriculum well. And I was so skeptical at first, but now when I walk into schools, I see like we have made all these thousands of schools better places for kids in a way that we never could have before. We still have our 150 schools that handcraft their curriculum that I love, but we couldn't have scaled that.
It's a really interesting story around, the fine wine versus the big distillery. A lot of the things that we can see in education at a small level, we can't necessarily always scale. And so we're missing out on the potential for impact. I'm mindful that if you're sitting here, you might be thinking curriculum material is kind of a vague term. What are we actually talking about? So I want to just share my screen, give me a moment, and actually show what the curriculum, so a snapshot of some of the curriculum materials that EL Education produce and what they look like. So give me a moment while I put up my slides. Can you see that, Ron?
Yes. That's really clear.
So this is actually, for those who are really listening at home, we actually put these images in the appendix of the report. Some people might not have gotten to it, but we put these in as just making it quite concrete. What are we actually talking about here when we're talking about materials? And this is just a snapshot of the Year 8 curriculum map. So the things that I found interesting, and there's a lot of detail in here, but actually that's kind of the point. I looked at them and was like, wow, these are detailed. So, you can see for Year 8, they've got separate modules. There's an anchor text for each one of them that's planned out, as well as the other texts you might use. For each module, there's the unit, the relationship to the Common Core standards, but then also an understanding of what assessments could be used as part of those, like writing a narrative or particular research that you might be doing. And then as part of the units, it actually breaks it down into, okay, lessons, weeks 1 to 2, you might have 1 to 7 lessons, 8 to 10 in week 1 and 2. So it's actually breaking down those units, and you can see how that high level planning flows down into each lesson. So that's really interesting. When I think about a curriculum map, this is the one for Year 8, but there's also all the other ones in the years prior on Year 7, Year 6 that feed into that Year 8 curriculum. When you look the next level down and you look, okay, if this is a unit, now I can see here's one lesson, and actually it goes into a bit of detail around how might you open the lesson, what might students be doing, closing, homework, and some of those lesson targets and ongoing assessment, that kind of formative assessment where you're continuing to get feedback from students on their learning. And then just a couple of examples of, okay, here's the materials that are all editable. I think these are in Word documents when you download them from EL Education's website. You can see this lesson, students would be looking at and analysing this poem. That's pretty common in English classes. I used to be an English teacher. But the thing that I found quite amazing was there's actually some suggestions and directions in here around, here's what you might ask students. Here's how you might actually conduct a close reading of this text. Some of the words you might pick out and how you might create a rich discussion with students in your classroom, or some of the words that you might actually need to stop and pause on because they don't understand it immediately. And then also the worksheets that might go through it. That means that there's a lot less on teachers individually creating a sheet themselves rather than adapting something that's already there. And then finally, this is just a snapshot of some of the assessment tasks. So one of these was comparing and contrasting two poems here, and there's also, you can see on the left-hand side, but then there's also accompanying teacher guidance notes. So you have an understanding of what a model answer might look like, not just you've got an assessment but you're not really sure what students should be responding, or what a great response might look like. So that's just a snapshot of the materials. So we have them, I suppose, in our minds while we're talking about them. Ron, it would be great to hear a bit about, I mean, when I looked at these, I was like, wow, they're so detailed. There's that top level plan. It goes all the way down to the lesson level. So if you really needed something, you could grab it, but it would take a while to get to know. Can you tell us a bit more about the decisions you made and why you decided to design the materials this way?
Sure, Amy. Well, the Common Core standards had just hit in America, and they were adopted by almost every state. And the standards were very big and very intimidating to people. How could you possibly have kids meet all those standards in English language arts or in mathematics during a year for whatever grade kids were in? So we started with the standards, and we thought, can we actually create a curriculum where if kids were to go through it, they would meet every standard? Like they would actually work. And that was something that for an individual teacher to do would be really difficult. We brought it right down to the lesson level with every lesson, every assessment, and every piece of material a teacher would need. And we had concerns at first. Being that descriptive, would it feel prescriptive? Would it feel like it diminished the professionalism of teachers if we spelled out everything? And so we tried out doing a less descriptive version of it, of not giving everything, letting teachers fill in. And teachers said, we want to be able to choose it if we want it. We want everything spelled out in case we need it. And so we ended up really filling in everything, all the lessons, all the materials, all the assessments, all the structures for running your classroom in it. And we know that teachers can customize. It's open source. It's not copyrighted in a traditional way. It's adaptable by teachers as they need to their own context. But if a teacher needs these things already and prepared for her, it's there. Everything is there. And so we ended up making it fully comprehensive. Interestingly, there's no textbook, like there's no English book. It's lessons built on trade books. So the books are fiction or nonfiction books or poems or things from media that are from the real world. They're not a textbook sample. And kids are reading novels and they're reading nonfiction books and they're digging into it. So that was a premise of ours right from the beginning. We want kids in real books and real world materials when we do this. Another guiding principle for this is that we believe that kids should be becoming better human beings while they're becoming better readers and writers. So we had goals for kids' character at the same time as we have goals for their literacy built into every lesson. So our vision was, could we create something fully comprehensive that teachers could have everything they needed if they needed it, but have it flexible in a way that if they wanted to customize, they could. That was our vision.
Yeah. And I think it definitely comes to a point that we hear a little bit or a lot about how well am I going to be able to tailor these materials to my class, and knowing that I'll need to actually do some of that work if it's going to hit the right spot for my students. One of the other things I remember talking about with you is the importance of materials that enable student talk. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this curriculum is in many ways an engine for teacher development. So using the curriculum itself, if it's a good curriculum, should be a professional development experience in itself for teachers. Because our pedagogical vision was kids should do most of the thinking, kids should do most of the work, and kids should do most of the talking. And so it's not a curriculum that has teachers standing up and talking in front of kids very long. The teacher talk is very small, and the kid grappling and the kid talk is deep. So kids have to work individually and struggle with difficult texts individually. Then they have to meet in small groups and struggle with text and make sense of text together. Then groups have to present their thinking to the rest of the class using protocols. And so it changes the teacher's role a lot from being a person who stands in front of the room and just talks to being someone who's coordinating the kids and getting them to do the hard work. And that's, I think, been the biggest change for teachers who have begun using the curriculum is their classrooms are different now. Kids have to speak up more. They have to defend their thinking more. They have to do the harder work. It's not being done for them. The questions are really deep, and kids are critiquing each other and asking questions. And when I first visited schools that were using the curriculum and asked teachers, how are things different here? They said the protocols are what changed everything for me. Because my kids used to just sit and listen to me, and now they're grappling with each other and debating each other and critiquing each other and agreeing with each other and disagreeing with each other. And, kids' voices are there. The classrooms are really lively. And many teachers said to me, I didn't think my kids could do that. I didn't think they had it in them. They're so much more capable and sophisticated than I realized. So our big hope is that the curriculum will be a transformational process for teachers that will change their pedagogy to more kid-centered and more demanding, like just asking more of kids.
And just hearing you describe that, having been an English teacher, it's kind of the holy grail of, there's actually enough of that strong textual knowledge of the text we're looking at, the way that language features are working, the ideas that are behind it, that you can actually have a debate in class with students, which sounds incredibly exciting. I think one of the, I suppose, elephants in the room is around, if you've got such detailed curriculum materials and there's flexibility in how you might use them, but it also means they can be quite overwhelming. That process of going, okay, well, how do I actually change my practice to mean that I'm building students strong foundational knowledge, but then I'm letting them use that and then being able to talk up in class. That's a lot for a teacher to change. So I'm just mindful of, in your experience, what are the conditions that teachers need to be able to actually use and adapt these materials effectively and use them really well when they're in class?
Yeah, excellent question. And there's no easy answer to that, Amy, as you would guess. A really good curriculum is going to be hard. If it's a good curriculum, it's going to demand more of kids than anything that they've done before. And that's going to be a lot for teachers to take on. How do I ask more of my students in terms of their thinking level? It means I change my own practice. So the first thing I would say is it takes time. It's not going to happen instantly. A really good curriculum is not one that you're going to get and then a day later you can deliver it well. It has to blend into your professional vision as a teacher, and you have to make it your own. And it may take a year or 2 years before you're really strong at using the curriculum. When we had a third-party study of how well does this curriculum boost the assessments, the test scores of kids, what we found was year one, it did a lot of change in teacher practice, but there was a slight lag in kids. Kids' test scores didn't immediately go up the first year that a teacher was using it. The second year that same teacher was using the curriculum, there was a really good bump in test scores because we learned it took the teacher really a year to get her stride about how to use it well. So one of them is having some patience, which is hard for us in the Western world, to have patience of it's going to take some time to get good with this. Another thing is that teachers need a lot of professional development and support in using the curriculum. And that professional development has to be done respecting them as professionals. So when we partner with a district, the way we stay afloat financially as a nonprofit, Amy, is our curriculum is free, right? You can download it for free. So how do we even stay alive as a company, a nonprofit company? Well, the city of Detroit, which was a struggling city, used to have 2 million people. Now it has 700,000 people. A lot of poverty. School scores were terrible. The city of Detroit said, okay, we're going to adopt a curriculum for every student in the entire city. Mm-hmm. And we will give you, $2 million to come in and work with all of our teachers in their transformation. And so we went as an organization and did teacher development in the summer prior to the opening of school. But our teacher professional development was respectful of their professional background. It wasn't sit in a room and listen and look at slides. It was, here's the work. Let's look at it together. Ask questions about it. Be skeptical about it. Try it out. Talk to each other about it. Figure out what's making sense to you, what's not making sense to you, what makes you mad, what seems good to you. Like, teachers were in small groups with a facilitator, arguing and debating about how do I use it, what's going to work, what's not going to work. And all their skepticism and all their criticism was welcomed. Because they're professionals. We shouldn't say, oh no, this is the new way to do it, you should just follow this. It was, here's what we're offering you, what makes sense to you, what doesn't, how will it fit to your practice? And the whole first year teachers were using it. They were asking questions, they were being skeptical of it, we were welcoming that. How do you make it your own in a way that works for you? What modifications are you doing that's making it work with your students? So treating teachers as professionals, making the professional development active and engaging for people, not sit and listen, and having their own thinking and ideas part of the professional development, and then keeping coaches there all year long so that teachers could meet with coaches when they're struggling with parts of it, or they can't fit in parts of it, or some parts they're having a challenge, having someone on call there that could help them out. I will say, after 1 year in Detroit, it was the first time in the history of Detroit that their ELA, their English Language Arts test scores, went up in every single grade level.
Wow.
Every single demographic of student. And they had never had that in the city ever before. And so that was a case where there wasn't even a great lag, because within a year, every single grade had a real bump. And made more progress than the state as a whole. So it was gratifying to go to Detroit and see teachers said, when you gave me this curriculum, I thought, it's crazy. It's too hard. It's too much. And my students will never be able to do it. They just won't be able to do it. And I actually felt that way for the first month. And here you are, like 2 months later, look at my students are doing this stuff. Like, they're doing stuff I never imagined they could have done. And I realized, how could I have been skeptical about this as a contribution? This is really being an amazing contribution, and every kid in Detroit is using it, and it's helping lift every school in one way. So I was so wrong, and now I'm so proud that we have this out there as a resource.
That is such a great story to tell, and very, very exciting to hear as well. I think particularly for us, we see the potential of curriculum materials, but we also see how curriculum materials they're the first step. And that long investment in professional development, which acknowledges teachers' own expertise, what they'll know about what it means to actually put it into practice in a classroom, needs to be respected as well. So that's a great story. Thank you. I'm mindful that we're almost at about half past, and we did have some very diligent folk who sent in some questions. We also have a couple of questions that I've seen come up on the Q&A, but haven't gotten to read just yet. So we might turn to some questions that people have asked, who are hopefully in the audience as well, or going to listen afterwards. So the first question, there's a couple that people wanted to know about the role of governments. And the first one somebody asked was around the role of governments, or what is the role of governments and departments for endorsing high quality curriculum materials? From our view at Grattan, and Ron, you'll be able to speak to this as somebody on the ground who knows it. One model that we looked at quite keenly and recommended Australia take on something similar is the Ed Reports model. So Ed Reports is a not-for-profit that exists in the United States. They've been around for about a decade, and really their core job is that they review curriculum materials. They focus on materials that are comprehensive. So like EL education, they have to be at least a year, but sometimes years long. They bring in teams of teachers, they train them up to actually review the quality of these materials. Those teachers work together for about 4 to 6 months, reviewing, they'll turn the page if it's a physical resource of every single page of a particular set of materials and check, okay, does this meet the content standards that we need for the Common Core or national curriculum? Does it align with the evidence about how we know this should be taught? And in this particular year level or subject area? And also, is it actually usable for teachers? So does it give teachers enough guidance that, they can see how they might adjust it for particular learners? Does it tell them how they might approach certain things if they need to change them? So we think that's a great model because what they do once they've finished those reviews is they actually just publish it up online. So Ed Reports, you can go on there, they've got summaries, but they've also got all the detailed information, hundreds of pages of reports of here's what the conclusions we came to. And it just arms school leaders and also governments with information about the quality of materials. It is completely impossible that teachers would be able to on their own do all that work themselves. So we think that that's a really great option that should exist in Australia. But Ron, I'd love to hear your views. You know more about EL Ed Reports from having been through the process in the US. So how have you seen Ed Reports play out there?
Yeah, as an organization, Amy, Ed Reports has been so important, not just to our organization, but nationally as these new standards were adopted. In the US, it was really hard to know which things align to those new standards and which don't. Because every publisher, and most publishers are commercial publishers, they're for profits, and that's not bad. Some of them are terrific, but they're all going to claim that their standards aligned and that they're all going to claim that they meet everything, right? So every new curriculum and every publisher that puts out any product says standards aligned. And so how do you know which ones really are actually meeting all the standards when they all claim they are? Having that nonprofit was so helpful. There's a publication in the US called Consumer Reports, where if people want to buy a truck or they want to buy a washing machine, you go on and it's a nonprofit that tests them all and gives you honest results. Like this truck breaks down all the time, or this washing machine, this doesn't work in this way.
I've bought white goods going through a similar process. So yes.
Yeah. So, you could trust Consumer Reports is going to be unbiased. Ed Reports is that for curriculum. So they really go through all the different curricula that are out there and they say which ones actually meet standards. And what was amazing for us was that when we came out with our curriculum, we got all top scores on Ed Reports. And some of the big commercial publishers who make billions of dollars selling the stuff didn't get such good scores. And so one of the reasons that Detroit and Raleigh and Richmond and Oakland and Boston and New York came to us and said, we want your curriculum, was the Ed Report scores. They said, you're outscoring the major publishers, so we trust that it's good. And it really is trustable. That's it. I think it's a terrific organization.
Yeah, and I think
not just because it helped us, because it helped everyone in America know what's an unbiased opinion here.
And I think one of the important parts of their model is that they actually work with publishers once a review's gone out. So there's a number of publishers that they've worked with and they've made changes, and then new materials have come out to work to meet that standard. But at least the standard is clear in terms of what quality should look like.
That is a role that government and policymakers can play in Australia. Because the government can take on an unbiased view of is the curriculum really matching the national curriculum? Like, are these new products actually aligned in the ways we would hope they were? And do they promote the kind of pedagogy that we believe is important for kids? In some ways, it's a better role for government than having to develop the curriculum itself. Developing the curriculum oneself is crazy hard. I mean, I shared with you and Jordana that we invested $15 million to create the first version of K-8 curriculum. And that 15 million was hard for us to raise that amount of money to put into it. And then when that came out, we realized, we need modifications for English language learners. We need modifications for special education students. We need modifications for all these. We need print and digital versions that are responsive. We need to be able to make changes constantly. We need to revise it regularly. We need to prototype things and then try them out in classrooms and then revise them. And so it's another 15 million for the revision of that. I'm not sure it's a good investment for the government to have to get into that level of testing, prototyping, getting all that going. It's a long, intense process. But what government is really well poised to do is to say, here's our national curriculum, here's the standards, here's the pedagogy we want to promote. How are these products showing up? How are they showing up against each other in terms of things, so that you could trust a review of what products are out there that would be good for Australia?
Yeah, and I think you make some great points. And actually, that was a question that somebody had asked, was what should governments have, or what role should they have in terms of developing curriculum materials? And there's been, I think in Australia, it's really pleasing to see there's been a lot of Australian governments who are really interested in taking this curriculum implementation support seriously. So they're looking at, okay, how can we develop materials? There are some challenges with, bureaucrats holding the pen on that, in that there's political pressure around content. There's the kinds of things about, needing to maintain that you were talking about, Ron, and the difficulty of that with funding cycles. There's also the expertise that you need to be able to develop really strong, high quality materials that can be difficult. But I think what capped it off for us is that one is kind of not enough. Actually, what we want to see is a flourishing set of options that schools can choose from, where they know what quality is. So there is this issue around, if you create a set of materials in-house, it can also be perceived as being mandated, which I think we wouldn't want. And when we looked in our case study schools, what was really great was that they were able to choose the materials that fit their context. I'll go to another question, Ron, because I think we covered off on those first two that people asked. And we had another one where somebody was interested in the balance between high quality standardized curriculum materials and professional autonomy for teachers and school leaders to respond to their local conditions. So it'd be interesting to hear how you've seen that work for EL education.
Well, I love that when you frame that question, you use the word balance in there rather than binary either or, because it should never be either or. Originally, as I said, we believed everything should be handcrafted and meeting local context. And I actually think if you can do that well, it's a beautiful thing. But it's really hard for every school to do that well and every teacher to do that well. And so if that's not possible, then having materials that are high quality, that give every teacher what he or she needs to do it really well, is the perfect starting place. If they can localize it, if they can find local connections, if they can build on it, if they can take a case study locally that reflects what the curriculum is doing on a national level, that's perfect. So what we've been trying to do with teachers is having them start with the curriculum, and then when they've used it for a year, or they're strong with it, they feel confident with it, thinking, where are the local fieldwork sites you could use? Where are the local experts you could bring in? How do you connect the curriculum to your local context? How do you start customizing it yourself and building your own professional vision for how to use it? So it never should be an either or to me. I think the curriculum is a perfect starting place. And then when you feel like I'm meeting all the standards, my classroom is going well, think of all the ways now we can connect to our local context and contribute locally.
And it's interesting that I think, it provides this almost safety net. It sounds like you're saying, if there is something there, and then you can build on it. I think when we've, in answering this question and thinking about, that autonomy and how teachers need the capacity, those instructional minutes are what matter. They need the capacity to make those professional judgments in the moment in their classroom that are going to best suit the needs of their students. So in our case study schools, when we looked in there, we found that was best done when they'd taken this whole school approach. They collectively decided, here's the materials that we want to use, but they were often adapting them. They'd set out, and I'm thinking of one school where they'd set out, a reading spine across prep to grade 6. They knew what text they wanted to do, they'd taken some materials that were external, like core knowledge, but then they'd also brought in and created some bespoke just for their school that they wanted to use, and texts that they really wanted to study with their students. But because they were working from a base on some of them, they actually had the time to put into making really high quality materials for those other ones that they were going to from scratch. But they had the capacity to share that workload as well, because they were sharing materials and they decided what they were going to do together. I'm looking at the questions that have been submitted, and there's one in here thinking about differentiation, which I think has come through also. A couple of people asked about that when they were submitting questions earlier. So that's a really interesting one to think about, because teachers do need to be able to design to adapt for the needs of their classroom. How do you see, Ron, teachers using the EL education materials for those classroom needs? I know when I've looked at them, there's a lot of guidance that kind of underpins it around particularly English as an additional language students and how you might adapt for those, but just some of the parts of the EL education curriculum where they're specific about how you might differentiate.
Yeah, well, from the very beginning when we designed the curriculum, and our curriculum was entirely written by teachers for teachers. So we handpicked dozens and dozens of the best teachers from our best schools across the country and paid them to work in the summer writing curriculum with us guiding. And then they could take the curriculum they wrote and test it out in their classrooms in the fall. And when it wasn't working, they could modify it and change it. So there's a long piloting process. The teachers themselves wrote it. Differentiation was one of the most important things that we focused on from the beginning. But over the years, Amy, we've actually realized, as committed as we were to differentiation and universal design, we still weren't doing enough. And so we then had to bring in experts in English language learners and experts in learning disabilities to create all different kinds of additional versions and modifications and supports to make sure every learner was being supported well enough. I mean, we do have a perspective that the work itself should not be simplified for kids. Kids should all be doing the same challenging work with the same challenging text. What should be differentiated is the support that those kids get. So we don't say, oh, Amy's doing well, so she stays at her grade level, but Ron is behind, so we're going to give him work that's a grade level or two behind. We never do that. We keep all the work at the grade standard, but we say Ron's struggling, so here are all the support mechanisms we're going to build in for Ron so that he can still meet those same standards.
I think that's a great point, that distinction around, if you are going to tailor instruction, making sure that kids still have access to the same curriculum and an opportunity to master it, but the supports might be slightly different. I know, thinking of a practical example of how I've seen one of our case study schools do this. So in one of our schools, the maths department, they had a collective agreement that they were going to use the same set of slides for a lesson. Let's say a lesson is on fractions. It might be 30 slides long, but it's kind of chunked up into different sections, and teachers decide how they're going to use them for their class. So they had 6 to 8 slides that were, essential slides, in that this held the essential content that we expect every student to be able to have access to and be able to learn and do and master. But either side of that, there might be a whole bunch of other slides that are more about reteaching concepts and checking whether students have the fundamentals before they get to those essential slides, and then more extension and independent practice. And depending on, it'll be a teacher's judgment. Okay, well, how fast do I need to go through this? Which problems am I actually going to go through? How slowly, what misconceptions do I guess my students will have, and which students might I go to first once we've gone to independent practice? Maybe we'll get there a bit slower in my class than the class next door. So we need materials that do enable that professional judgment. But what we found as well in our case study schools was when they actually had those materials and they shared them, it enabled better professional judgment, because they could say, how would you do this? You're going to do this slide as well. How are you going to teach it? How are you going to set it out on the board?
Right. And as in that great example you just shared, every student still had access to the same grade level standards for mathematics. It's just that there was different ways of supporting certain students to succeed with it. So
yeah, absolutely. Now, this has been such a great conversation, Ron, but I'm mindful that we're almost at our time. So I do want to say, I know that there are a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A chat. Please do reach out if there's anything you'd like to talk to us about. This recording will also go up on YouTube. If you think there's somebody else that would like to hear this conversation, that please do check in a couple of days on Grattan's YouTube channel. Ron, thank you so much. This has been a delight to start my morning, your evening with, and we really appreciate the work that you do at EL Education and the time that you've spent talking to us down under about curriculum materials and the impact that they can have in schools. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. I just want to give my best to all the great educators there in Australia, and thank you for joining today and for your interest in this topic.
Yeah, perfect. I think I would, to finally close out, I'd just say that if you're interested in any of the work that you've heard us talk about, it's all freely available on our website. If you want to read more about it, there's also an opportunity. Grattan is a not-for-profit. If you want to support our work and see more of it, you can donate there as well. On that note, I think we will leave everyone to the rest of their day. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you coming along.